Next, a Minnesota Senate debate between incumbent Democrat Tina Smith and Republican challenger Jason Lewis. Held virtually by NPR News, this is Close to an Hour.
This is NPR News. I'm Mike Mulcahy. One of the key races on the Minnesota ballot this November is for U.S. Senator. Democrat Tina Smith is the incumbent. She's a former lieutenant governor, was first appointed to the seat by Governor Mark Dayton early in 2018, and she won a special election 2 years ago. If she wins this year, it will be for a full 6-year term. Her Republican opponent is Jason Lewis. He served a term in Congress from Minnesota's 2nd District and is also a former talk radio host. Tina Smith and Jason Lewis join me remotely this hour as part of our Meet the Candidates series to talk about the issues facing Minnesota and the country. And there aren't a lot of rules for our conversation today. I will ask you a series of questions. I ask you to keep to the issues, even though you're running for the Senate. We really don't need to filibuster. I'll give you each plenty of time to lay out your views and to respond to each other. One firm rule, though, that I will enforce is that you can't talk over each other. It really sounds bad on the radio. People will turn us off, and then nobody will hear what you have to say. I'll give you each a minute at the start and a minute at the end to make the case for why the voters should pick you. I flipped a coin before we started. Jason Lewis, you get the first minute. Why should you be the U.S. Senator from Minnesota?
Well, Mike, thank you, and thank you all for doing this. Appreciate it. I guess we can filibuster while we've still got the chance. Because if our friends on the other side of the aisle have their way, there will be no electoral college, no filibuster, new statehood, and they will pack the Supreme Court. In fact, I think that's one of the things that should come out of this particular debate, and that is you don't mess with the court. You don't mess with the separation of powers. You don't threaten to pack the court until they rule your way. That is a full frontal assault on judicial review. Even FDR was shut down when he floated the idea. Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought it was a horrible idea. That's a real threat to self-government and to our constitutional republic. So while we talk about the Supreme Court nominee and we talk about Amy Coney Barrett, let's make certain we're not going down a very, very dangerous path of packing the Supreme Court. Also, of course, we've got to talk about public safety. Everything's changed since this summer and the riots and what's happened all across Minnesota and all across this country. You're either going to back law enforcement and you're going to make certain that we don't have one bad apple and then smear an entire profession, which we wouldn't do for anybody else, but we seem to be doing for law enforcement.
Okay, that's a minute.
I just don't approve of that. You bet.
That's a minute. Tina Smith, why are you the best choice this year?
Well, good morning, and thank you, Mike, and to Minnesota Public Radio for hosting this debate today, and for everybody who's out there listening in and sending in questions. So in this moment, Minnesota families are facing a health crisis and an economic crisis brought on by this pandemic. And we're also in the midst of a racial reckoning that is long overdue in this state and in this country. And we really are all in this together, and we all have to take responsibility. COVID can touch any of us, as we've seen again this morning with the news that the president and the first lady have contracted COVID. And we all wish them a speedy recovery and wish them the very best. So in the midst of this worry and uncertainty and division like I have never seen before, I want you all to know that I am working hard for you in Washington. I've listened to you, and then I've gone to work with Democrats and Republicans to pass more than 24 pieces of legislation, including lowering prescription drug prices, expanding rural broadband, supporting mental health, and making COVID tests free for everyone. So there's so much work to do, and I look forward to the conversation ahead.
Thank you. Jason Lewis, it is hard to ignore the news of the day. You were with President Trump on Air Force One Wednesday and at his rally in Duluth. Have you been tested? What's your status right now?
I've been tested about 4 times in the last 4 weeks because the president and the vice president have been to Minnesota so often. As you know, when you get together with them, you get tested. And fortunately, we maintain social distancing. I did talk to the president, but at a distance. I think we're just fine. But as a matter of precaution, we're going to quarantine until I can get a chance to get over to the doctor and get tested, just as the way we should do it, which is always the way we should do these things. You should test and quarantine those who are vulnerable, been exposed, or are sick. But a second Great Depression by locking down the country again, which Vice President Biden and my opponent Tina Smith seem to want to do, is not the answer to solve this disease. So
Okay.
we're going to take the normal precautions we would, but we're not going to tell people who are otherwise healthy that they can't go about their business.
All right, well, let's stay on the topic of the pandemic. It's killed more than 200,000 Americans, more than 2,000 Minnesotans. As you mentioned, it's had a major impact on the economy. What should the U.S. government do? What would you support in the Senate to both keep us safe and to allow businesses and other public places to reopen and get back to normal? Tina Smith, start with you.
Well, thank you. I think
Smith?
COVID has really shown us. Yeah, I think COVID has really shown us that, as somebody said in southern Minnesota, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And as I said, this is a public health and economic crisis, and it's really personal for Minnesotans. It's your job, your family, your businesses, your well-being. So my approach in the Senate has been bipartisan, to work across the aisle to get support to families, support to small businesses, and also support to hospitals, especially rural hospitals. The Trump administration's response to the COVID pandemic has been, it's been a disaster. There has been a lack of coordinated strategy. There has been a shortage of testing and personal protective equipment. And as we sit here today, we've lost over 200,000 Minnesotan Americans. So what I think we need to do next in the Senate is, first, we need to continue to push for bipartisan solutions to get help to small businesses and individuals. We need to get help to our schools and to state and local governments. We need a national testing strategy, which I am pushing forward with my colleague, my Republican colleague from Louisiana, Dr. Bill Cassidy. And we need a plan for free vaccines. Those vaccines, this is a bright spot for us in the pandemic. Vaccines that are safe and effective. We need to make sure we keep the political interference out of the rollout of the vaccines. But when they're ready, we need to make sure that they're free for everyone. And that's legislation that I'm working on in the Senate.
Jason Lewis, what would you do to get the country out of this? And what would you do in the Senate to get us there?
Well, the first thing I do in the Senate is pass COVID relief, of which my opponent has opposed 3 times, and they're still opposing COVID relief. So they say on the one hand, this is an existential threat. H1N1 had 60 million infections, not 7 million. But they say it's an existential threat. But Joe Biden's campaign yesterday said they were going to start door knocking again. No word on that yet in the wake of the news today. You had Nancy Pelosi say, come to Chinatown. It's not a problem. Bill de Blasio saying the same thing. What is a real crisis is what's happened in New York and New Jersey and Minnesota, where you took COVID positive patients out of a hospital and put them in a long-term congregated living facility, nursing homes. Our MDH was doing that. The Governor Walz's administration was doing that. No criticism from Tina Smith. What you do is exactly what we've been saying you do. You quarantine those who are sick, you protect the vulnerable, and then the health authorities give recommendations for the rest of the country and treat them as adults. And we will get through this together. But we can't go through, as I said earlier, these massive shutdowns and lockdowns. And now the Biden, Harris, and Smith plan is to have a federal mask mandate along with federal shutdowns. You're not going to cure this with another Great Depression. Give the COVID relief. We're flattening the curve by any standard. And now we're seeing some spikes in cases, obviously today, but we're seeing hospitalizations down double digits since the summer and COVID mortality, thankfully, dropping like a rock. And that's good.
Tina Smith, do you support a nationwide shutdown?
I don't. There is no such thing as a nationwide shutdown. Here are the facts. The most important thing we can do to get our economy back on track, to be running back at full steam ahead, is to deal with the public health crisis that we have. That's the most important thing. Now, there's a clear difference here between my opponent and the approach that I've taken. I have had strong support for bipartisan bills that have gotten help to Minnesotans, and I'm very proud of that. In the Senate, you get things done when you compromise, when you reach across party lines to make a difference in people's lives and in Minnesotans' life. Now, my opponent has said that compromise makes him nervous. He has said that in this issue about whether people should be wearing masks or not, he's ridiculed the public health experts. He said that they are part of the deep state. He pushes conspiracy theories that death counts are exaggerated, and he sued the governor. This is not the way to get things done for Minnesotans. The way to get things done is to reach across party lines, to find common ground, and then to focus on people's lives and what you can do to help them. And that's been my approach.
Jason Lewis, if you and the president
had been... It's been my approach too, Mike. I compromised with Bobby Scott on juvenile justice reform.
Okay. If you and the president had been wearing masks the other day, though, you wouldn't have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks, right?
Well, you know, your question and Tina dodged the point about a federal mask mandate. I am opposed to a federal mask mandate. I think it's unconstitutional. Joe Biden has said he's in favor of one. I'd like to hear the senator's view on that at some point. Hawaii had an indoor and outdoor mask mandate. And what happened in Hawaii this summer? Their cases increased 10. This is a contagion. It's tough to control. You go about your business and do the best you can protecting the vulnerable by not putting COVID positive patients in nursing homes. But if your point is we're going to shut down every resort in northern Minnesota, we're going to tell kids they can't go back to school, we're going to basically block economic progress, you're never going to get to the bottom of this because you need economic growth to cure the disease, develop the vaccines and the therapeutics. That's my point.
Tina Smith, Jason Lewis said you voted against aid packages in the Senate. You have. What kind of package should the Senate pass? Who should get the help?
Well, I'm glad that you raised that because this is a place where former Congressman Lewis is, he's entitled to his own opinions, but not his own facts. We have passed bipartisan legislation and we have gotten things done because we passed bipartisan legislation. Now, Congressman Lewis likes to point out the legislation that I voted against, but let me explain what that's about. When the Republicans in the Senate put together partisan legislation that doesn't meet the needs of Minnesotans, I voted against those legislation. And then, do you know what happened? We came back together and we improved those pieces of legislation in order to get the help that Minnesotans needed. I voted against legislation that the Republicans put forward that had zero help for Minnesota schools and national schools. And then we negotiated, we compromised, and we got dollars for schools. I voted against legislation that had $0 for state and local governments and tribal governments. And then we came together and we negotiated and we compromised and we got resources for public services. That's what it looks like when you get things done in the Senate. And I'm proud of that work.
Should there be another aid package, Senator Smith?
There should be another aid package.
Is that for me, Mike, or her?
That's for Tina Smith.
Yeah.
I'll get right back to you, Jason Lewis.
All right.
Thanks so much. And in fact, yesterday, the House of Representatives passed another aid package, another effort by Democrats to compromise and to try to find common ground. There's been significant work that's happened between Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin. Unfortunately, that hasn't borne fruit yet. But meanwhile, the Republicans in the Senate have been completely on the sidelines, offering no solutions and not moving us forward. And it's unfortunate because, boy, I talk to small businesses in Minnesota. I talk to families. I talk to people who are worried about their schools, and we need to come to a resolution on this.
Jason Lewis, what kind of package would you support in the Senate to help people out in all this?
Well, indeed, facts are stubborn things, Senator. You voted against 3 COVID packages that would have gone directly to Minnesotans, not to state government, not to other governmental organizations, but right to Minnesotans. There's $1 trillion package sitting there right now the Democrats are holding up. So those are the facts, and you can, if you're holding up an aid package because you want incarcerated felons to get the vote, your heart isn't in the right place. That has nothing to do with COVID relief, and that was that was one of the demands in one of the previous COVID relief packages that the Democrats were demanding. There's a bill right now ready to go, and the Democrats are holding it up. So I would have voted for all of the first 3 packages I mentioned, including the ones Mitch McConnell has on the table right now. But in the final analysis, we've got to get the economy going again and not just keep passing relief packages after relief packages. I think if the government shuts down the economy, they have an obligation to help out of work. But Tennessee, Florida, a number of states are getting their economies going again, and Minnesota isn't, sadly.
We're talking with Jason Lewis. He's the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate. Tina Smith, she's the DFL senator and is running again this year. All the voters in Minnesota will get a say in this race, and they'll decide who serves the next 6-year term in the Senate. Let me change the subject to police and public safety, a huge issue, especially after the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers on Memorial Day and everything that followed after that. Jason Lewis, what would you do as senator to ensure that all people, and especially people of color, receive equal justice under the law? Well,
it's not a matter of what I would do. It's what I did. When I reach across the aisle with Representative Bobby Scott, a liberal Democrat from Virginia. We reauthorized the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, which has been sitting dormant for 15 years. I reached across the aisle with Dan Lipinski, with a number of Democrats in my term in the House of Representatives. We were moving in the right direction on criminal justice reform, not just my Juvenile Justice Reform Act, which didn't put young first-time offenders in jail with hardened criminals, gave them a career and technical education instead, but also with the First Step Act. But one injustice doesn't solve another, and the riots in the wake of all of these tragedies are simply uncalled. Joe Biden saying Antifa is an idea, not an organization, while magically these pile of bricks show up in Kenosha, Chicago, and Minneapolis, and in Portland. You have a group that's caused $2 billion worth of economic damage, and they're calling them peaceful protests. There is a real problem out there when your government doesn't back law enforcement. I do. And once you don't back law enforcement, then the word gets out pretty quick to people who want to do damage to life, liberty, and property. I don't believe that, and I think my opponent does when she talks about, the dangerous role police play in society, or crazy comments like it's a privilege to call the police. That is dangerous stuff for Minnesota, and I'm not going to support that, but unfortunately, Tina Smith does.
Tina Smith, how do you ensure that everybody gets equal justice in this country?
Well, everybody should feel safe in their homes and in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis has shown a bright light on how that is not the case in our state and in our country. And this is a moment, I believe, where we have laid bare the inequities and the discrimination that exists in our criminal justice system, in our policing. And it is our responsibility. It's a call to our humanity to look at this and to address it. So what do we do about this? I support common sense reforms that are going to bring more accountability and more transparency and more justice to policing. The Justice in Policing Act, which I support in the United States Senate, would do things like ban chokeholds and racial profiling and the no-knock warrants that are what were the forerunner of Breonna Taylor being murdered in her own bed. I support changing the rules so that police officers who violate people's rights and use excessive force can be held accountable. And I support a national registry for police misconduct so officers can't jump from one jurisdiction to the next and not be held accountable for their excesses in another place. I understand these issues because I worked as the chief of staff for the mayor of Minneapolis and as the lieutenant governor, and I've worked closely with law enforcement. And I've seen what happens when good cops are trapped in a system where there is no accountability, and you end up with what we have today in this country, where far too often people of color are much more likely to be the victims of excessive force and to be the victims of violence.
What about the people who rioted? What about the property damage after the killing of George Floyd? Tina Smith.
We all condemn violence and arson and looting. And if you break the law, you should be held accountable. And everybody deserves equal justice in this country. But in this moment where we are facing the realities of racial inequity, I have to say, to listen to our president in the debate earlier this week fail repeatedly to condemn white supremacy. It took him 2 days to be able to get the words out that he condemns white supremacy, to hear him to call on the Proud Boys, which is a violent white supremacist hate group, to call them to stand by is the exact kind of thing that we don't need in our country. And I've not heard my opponent condemn that. This is a moment where we need to come together around our shared values and not be more and more driving us apart, which is the path that the president and my opponent want to lead us down.
Jason Lewis, will you condemn white supremacists?
Of course, we all have condemned them, including the president months ago. But I believe in due process for all do, including for law enforcement officers. And that's a difference between myself and Tina Smith. She's in this reimagine the police mode with the Bernie Sanders manifesto, which nobody knows what it means except the Minneapolis City Council, who is voting to defund the police and then blame them. She wants to take away qualified immunity from policemen and women. Now, I like to say I didn't know much about cops till I married one. I can tell you from personal discussions, that's a very, very dangerous thing. If you want policemen and women to do their job, but you're going to sue them, and when they make good faith decisions in a split second, that's what Tina Smith supports. The Tim Scott bill, which collected data, addressed the chokeholds, did all of the rest of the things she opposed because it didn't take away qualified immunity for law enforcement. That is not backing the blue, and that's a huge distinction here. But the fundamental problem right now, and I've talked to literally 20 businesses in Minneapolis and St. Paul, most of them owned by people of color, and to a person they said, we don't have a problem with too little police or too many police. We have a problem with too little police. We need them on the street. And now police are resigning in Minneapolis in droves. And 3 chiefs of police who are all people of color in Rochester, in Dallas, throughout this country, in Seattle, were driven from their jobs by the Antifa mob and by this obsession with going after cops. That doesn't help people of color. They are people of color who were chiefs of police trying to do their job. Who speaks for them? Well, I'm going to.
Tina Smith, what about this qualified immunity issue, and how do you restore that trust in the police department?
Well, as I said, I believe that we need to change the rules so that police departments and police officers can be held accountable. And that is too often not the case right now. But, if you listen to my opponent, what you hear him trying to suggest is that we face in this country a choice between law and order and rioting and mayhem in the streets. And of course, that isn't the choice. The choice is, what do we do to have public safety for everyone in this country, for people to be safe everywhere in this country? Now, here's one thing that I want to just highlight as a way of going about this. I am working on legislation. We know that policing is managed and run at the local level, not at the federal level. But I think the federal government can be a good partner with local government. So I am sponsoring legislation that would allow federal government support for innovations at the local level. Like, for example, the idea that you could send co-responders, police officers and co-responder when somebody is having a mental health crisis. The police officer is not often well positioned or well trained to deal with that kind of a mental health crisis. So let's have 2 people go to help make sure that that person who is having a crisis can get the help that they need rather than result in more violence.
Jason Lewis, what about that? Why should the police have to respond to mental health crisis?
It started with abolishing ICE, about going after Border Patrol agents, and now they're going after police. This is a question between law and order and riots. You can't have $2 billion worth of damage. You can't have riots 100 straight days in Portland, Oregon. You can't have the Minneapolis City Council defunding the police and then complaining about the police, then getting their own private security. Anybody who's got this defunding the police, abolish the police, reimagining the police, really ought to go without Capitol Hill security, Senator, really ought to go without their own private security. This is hypocrisy at an unbelievable level. They want to put people in danger in communities, and most of them in communities of color, quite frankly. But now it's spreading everywhere, and yet they don't give up their own security. That's a little rich. The fact is, you can't do anything without public order. And we've got to restore public order, and we can address all of these issues, which we all support, but you can't do it with riots in the streets every night.
Tina Smith, do you want to defund the police?
No, I do not. I do not want to defund the police, and I've said that consistently. Those are the facts. And as I said, the most important thing is that we have to understand that there are things we need to do to improve the way public safety works in our society. We need to address the underlying challenges that result in a lack of safety in our society. And that is not about being against police officers. As I said, I've worked closely with the Minneapolis Police Department, and I have seen many, many fine cops who go above and beyond to keep people safe. The question is, how can we make sure that the systems of policing, which too often have racist outcomes, are fixed so that everybody can be safe?
All right.
One more thing there,
right,
Mike.
Jason
One more
Lewis.
thing there, Mike. She talks about not now being for defunding the police. That wasn't the rhetoric coming from her earlier on when she was right there with the Minneapolis City Council, talked about more righteous protest, taking it to the streets, and reimagining the police, which she has never defined. There's a reason I've got the endorsement from the Fraternal Order of Police in Minnesota, the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, the Minneapolis Police Federation, is because they trust me to back those people on the street. They don't trust the senator.
Well, let's move on to a different subject because our time is fleeting. There were some stories in the news this week, not necessarily on the front page, and I'll give you some of the headlines. 70,000 people remain evacuated in California's wine country as wildfires continue to burn. The Greenland ice sheet is on track to melt at a faster rate than seen in 12,000 years. 4 tornadoes were confirmed to have touched down in the August derecho storm that hit Iowa and caused an estimated $6 billion in crop damage alone. So the question is, and I heard this from a number of listeners, what will you support to combat climate change? How much will it cost? And how will it impact the economy? And Jason Lewis, let me start with you on that one.
Well, the good news is we're at the lowest rate of CO2 emissions since 1985 in the United States. We're doing our job. I can tell you the rest of the world will not do it as long as they're trying to grow their economy, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's any other country. And that's the problem with the Paris Accords and everything else. They basically put real punitive damages on America, but they don't do anything about the rest of the globe. And it's also the same sort of environmental problem, for instance, with mining on the Iron Range, which my opponent opposes. If you're going to farm that out to China, where we get 90% of our titanium, it's not going to be environmentally sound. But the question is, what would you do? I think there is a way to mitigate some of these effects, but I would not embrace a $93 trillion new tax called a Green New Deal, which my opponent would not oppose in the United States Senate. The question becomes, is the best way to mitigate things that does not shut down the economy, close the Iron Range, doesn't get Enbridge Line 3 built because you've got a war on fossil fuels? I would not do that.
Senator Smith, what would you support on combating climate change?
Well, with the West Coast burning up and so many hurricanes in the Gulf and in the Atlantic that we had to move to a whole new alphabet, there is no doubt that climate change is real and that we need bold action to address it. And I think about how Minnesota innovation has led the way in so many areas in healthcare and agriculture, and Minnesota innovation can lead the way on addressing climate change as well. We can do this in a way that makes energy more affordable, that gives us more control over our own energy, and creates jobs and opportunity for Minnesotans, and that's what I'm for. So in the Senate, what I've done is to work on legislation, introduce bipartisan legislation to expand research into renewables, to expand research into solar and wind, and also carbon capture and storage. I've authored legislation which would create a clean energy standard that provides regional flexibility for states to approach it in the best way possible to get us to net zero carbon emissions in the electricity sector. Minnesota is a land of renewable energy with biofuels as well, which creates a path for us to both, again, create jobs and also create opportunity. The United States and Minnesota can lead on clean energy, or we can hand that leadership off to other countries like China. And I think that we should lead. I think it's going to create opportunity for us. And we cannot ignore this. We cannot bury our heads in the sand with the impacts of climate change.
Jason Lewis.
I'd love to continue with this topic, Mike. The fact is, China is not leading the way in green energy. They are polluting. And the more we farm out to China because we ban things here, the more pollution we get globally. Take a look at what's happening in California. Now, they want to ban the sale of the internal combustion engine in 2035. I oppose that. Governor Walz, and I presume my opponent, she hasn't come out on this, want to adopt California emission standards. And now they have rolling blackouts because they basically have farmed out all of their traditional sources of power. So when there's a drought, when there's a heat wave, I should say, then everybody wants to import that electricity, and California's competing. That is not a good future for Minnesota to have rolling blackouts, nor are the forest fires when you don't manage forests. We've got this underbrush that serves as a tinder because we cannot manage our forests, and it's a real threat in the boundary water area, and we've got to make certain we do that. So if you look at the consequences of what the senator proposes, it's a California-style consequence where they're banning cars, they've got rolling blackouts, and they can't make ends meet. Some of this technology is simply not possible in the foreseeable future, and that's why you've got to build Enbridge Line 3, which will be a cleaner way to deliver crude to Minnesota's largest refinery in Pine Bend, which was in my congressional district, of course.
Tina Smith, I'll give you a last word to react to that.
Well, again, you see this sort of inflexible my way or the highway approach that I don't think is going to get us anywhere with addressing climate change. And it's not going to get us to passing legislation in the United States Senate, which should be our goal to make headway on this most important problem. I believe that there is great opportunity for Minnesota. We have some of the best solar and best wind resources of any place in the country. And that creates opportunities for us in Minnesota if we seize the opportunity and we move on it. That is what we should be able to do. And that's what I'm going to work for in the United States Senate when Minnesotans send me back.
All right. We're talking with Senator Tina Smith and her Republican challenger, Jason Lewis. This is NPR News. The Supreme Court. Mentioned it earlier. Senator Smith, if you are in the Senate next year, and if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court, would you support a move to add members to the court?
I'm just not going to go there. I have no idea what the world is going to look like. I think what we should be focused on right now is what is at stake with the Supreme Court nomination. What is at stake is whether or not Minnesotans and Americans are going to be able to keep their health care and whether women's reproductive rights are going to be protected. Sitting before the Supreme Court to be taken up by Justice Barrett, if she is confirmed, is a case led by the Trump administration to overturn the Affordable Care Act. And that would mean that millions of Americans who rely on insurance for their coverage for pre-existing conditions would lose that protection. Millions of Americans would lose their health insurance if the Affordable Care Act was overturned, something that my opponent has said that he thinks should happen. So in this moment, Minnesotans and Americans need to lift up their voices and ask themselves, is this the kind of Supreme Court that we want? Is this what we want to see happening, especially in the middle of a global pandemic? We should not be thinking about throwing people off of their health care and taking away protections for pre-existing conditions. So this is the most important thing.
What if it's the Supreme Court we have, though, and you're reelected and you're back in the Senate next year? What's your alternative? How do you fix that?
Well, I am not considering anything about packing the courts. That's not what I'm looking at. But what I'm focused on is that I will not concede that this is over. I believe that we've seen examples of this. I want to remind Minnesotans and Americans that when everybody thought that all was lost with the Affordable Care Act and there was another vote in front of the Senate to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Americans lifted up their voices and they spoke out. And by one vote, a handful of Republicans came over to protect the Affordable Care Act. And so I will not concede that there aren't a few Republicans that will see that this Supreme Court nomination is the wrong thing for our country. And also, this sort of hypocritical power grab that Mitch McConnell is using to force this lifetime appointment through when we are literally in the midst of an election. I think Americans and Minnesotans see right through that, and it's not what they want. We can see that.
Jason Lewis, a hypocritical power grab? Isn't that why Democrats are even considering something to change the makeup of the court?
Well,
the number isn't in the Constitution.
First of all, you don't get to be a senator from Minnesota without telling people what you're going to do. Tina Smith is pulling a Joe Biden here. Well, I'm not going to go there. That's not an answer. You're either going to pack the court, which I think your answer is yes, and undo the filibuster, which is in the Senate rules, and Majority Leader Schumer ostensibly has already said he would do it. So you either disagree with him, you agree with him, but you got to tell people where you stand. Packing the court is a dangerous scheme that's going to take this country from a constitutional republic to a banana republic. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said a couple of years ago, presidents don't get elected for 3 years. They get elected for 4. In 2016, we elected President Trump. In 2018, we expanded the Republican majority, and that is the difference between 2016. They want their officials to do their duty. Now, as to the notion of the Affordable Care Act, the Affordable Care Act is not up for being overturned. It's up for a question on severability, whether one section of a bill, if it's unconstitutional, would undo the whole thing. And historical precedent says that's not the case. But what Senator Smith is essentially saying is, I want a litmus test. I want a litmus test on how you're going to rule on the ACA, and I want a litmus test that what Daniel Patrick Moynihan called infanticide, partial birth abortion, and in some cases abortion for babies who survived a botched abortion, is somewhere in the Constitution. I vehemently oppose that. I'm pro-life. But more importantly, you don't tell a judge to telegraph what they're going to rule on a case before they've heard the facts. I have no idea how Amy Coney Barrett's going to rule on any of this, nor would I dare to ask her. That's totally inappropriate. And yet that's what Senator Smith is saying. It's my way or the highway. Where have we heard that before? I want to know how you're going to come out on these issues before I say aye. That is not the purpose of judicial or of the Senate confirmation. You're looking at judicial philosophy, not a preview of how they're going to rule.
Well, Congressman Lewis, wouldn't Merrick Garland argue that the president should be able to appoint a justice too? The Republicans
and the president did,
right. And the Republicans didn't give him a hearing. So how can you argue it's a fair process if now President Trump can appoint his and get her confirmed?
Because we've had an election since then, and the election was a Republican president was put in place. So when President Obama, who, by the way, thought in the 4th year of his presidency he should nominate someone, and he should, there was a Republican Senate whose job it was to give advice and consent. In this case, they said no. But you had different parties controlling 2 different branches. Today, since 2016, you've had the same party in the White House, and they expanded the Senate majority. But if you're talking, and that's the will of the people, I would add. So if you're talking about the will of the people said, I want a Republican president, I want a Republican Senate. That's what's moving this nomination forward. But packing the court, undoing the filibuster, giving a statehood to D.C. and Puerto Rico for one-party rule, banning the Electoral College, doing everything you possibly can to stay in power is not the will of the people. And I even forgot almost the fact that for the last 3 years, we've been engaged in a false Russian conspiracy hoax that tried to undermine an election. The Democrats' entire line recently has been, this is what the people voted for. What can we do to stop it?
Tina Smith, have you made up your mind beforehand? Are you trying to subvert the will of the people?
Well, first, I think we all know that Judge Barrett has been nominated to the Supreme Court by this president because, as he said himself, he would only nominate people to the Supreme Court who he knew would overturn Roe versus Wade, who would overturn the Affordable Care Act. Now, the former congressman, I think, is trying to distract everyone from something that is very important, which is the importance of the Affordable Care Act and what is at stake with the Affordable Care Act. And he has said that he does not support the Affordable Care Act and that he would support legislation which would strip away protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Now, think about this. We have had over 100,000 Minnesotans who have been diagnosed and have recovered from COVID. That is a pre-existing condition. Now, he will tell you that he supported legislation which had in its language no pre-existing conditions. But what he won't tell you is that that same legislation would have allowed insurance companies to go back to the bad old days when they could charge people anything if they had a pre-existing condition, or if they were a woman, or if they were a senior. An outside independent analysts have said that under his proposal, premiums would have gone up 20%, and over 20 million Americans would lost their insurance because they couldn't afford it. This is exactly the wrong direction to be going, especially in the middle of a pandemic.
Jason Lewis, quick response.
Yeah. Sure. Outside independent analysts. Well, no wonder. Those are called Democrat consultants. The CBO said our legislation would have dropped premiums anywhere from 20 to 30%. The bill I supported had this language, folks, quote, Nothing in this act shall be construed as permitting insurers to limit access to health coverage for individuals with pre-existing conditions, close quote. Kennedy Kassenbaum had the same sort of language in it, and that was universally passed. The real danger to healthcare is what Tina Smith supports in a public option, which would destroy Medicare as we know it. Navigant, if you want to talk about outside consultants, said it would close 49 rural hospitals. And Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator Smith's colleague, said the public option, which Smith supports, is a transition to single payer. That would devastate the healthcare markets. It would be a government takeover. The reimbursement rates would drop, and we'd be rationing by queue in the near distant future, which is why I opposed having government takeover in a single payer system.
Tina Smith, one more chance to respond, then we'll move on.
Well, everybody in this country should have access to high quality health insurance that they could afford, no matter who they are or where they live. And that's why we should be focusing on improving the Affordable Care Act, not tearing it down. We should be focusing on supporting Medicare, which is such an important part of health insurance for our seniors, not undoing it, as the former congressman has said, who supported $500 billion in cuts to Medicare. We should be looking at shoring up what we have and making it better and moving to a place where everybody has access to health insurance that they can afford. And that's why I support the public option, which would allow people to choose to buy into Medicare, for example, if they wanted to. And if they wanted to keep the insurance that they have from their employer or through their union, then that would be their option also.
All right, let's move to a different topic. President Trump said in Duluth this week that if Joe Biden is elected, he will turn Minnesota into, quote, a refugee camp. And he said that we were, quote, one of the hardest hit states when it comes to refugee resettlement. Overall, are refugees a good thing or a bad thing for Minnesota? Have their contributions been a positive or a negative? And Jason Lewis, let's start with you.
Yeah, look, I think the refugee process for political persecution is a long-standing tradition in America, which I wholly support. The question becomes, are we now taking refugees in, which are very, very costly, in some figures $80,000 to settle a refugee here in the state of Minnesota? Are we taking them in not for political persecution, which was the design of the program, or just sort of an open borders policy where anybody can come in, and it costs American taxpayers, Minnesota taxpayers, indeed a lot of money to do that. The key in front of local control in this particular situation is very much like sanctuary cities, which my opponent supports. They say, well, if you're gonna cooperate with ICE, we're going to become a sanctuary city and not enforce federal law. Well, you had a number of counties like Beltrami up north that said, look, we want to say as to how much we can afford, how many refugees we can take conceivably to manage our schools, to manage our social services. So we ought to have that local control, not unlike sanctuary cities. And I definitely supported that. The last winter, obviously, I did a town hall up there supporting those people, and I would continue to support local control. I think they have to have a say. But as long as it's designed for the reasons, nobody's opposed to that.
Tina Smith, where are you on this refugee resettlement question? The Trump administration has proposed reducing the number from 18,000 last year to 15,000 next year, and even the 18,000 is a historically low level of resettlement. What do you think about refugees in Minnesota?
Well, Minnesota has a long tradition, a proud tradition of welcoming refugees and asylum seekers. It is part of our faith tradition. And these refugees make our communities stronger. They make them more resilient. They are fueling our innovation and our creativity. They are fueling economic growth. When you go to main streets all over Minnesota, whether you are looking at main streets in Minneapolis on East Lake Street, or whether you're on main streets in Wilmer or Worthington, you can see the entrepreneurial activity and the contributions that refugees are making in this state and in this country. To hear the President of the United States, with Mr. Lewis there beside him, maligning refugees, using such hateful language to talk about our friends and neighbors who live here, who are contributing to our society, was a terrible thing to behold. It was shameful. Now, we need desperately to reform our immigration system in this country. We need to first undo the inhumane Trump immigration policy that has ripped children away from their parents at the border. I've gone down and I've seen that firsthand. We need to undo what this administration has done, which is so inhumane. And we need to reform our immigration system so that there's a path to citizenships for dreamers. We need to reform how our internal immigration works. We need strong borders. We need strong borders to keep things like African swine fever, which is such a threat to Minnesota's pork producers, out of the United States. And we need to improve how our legal immigration system works. You know, I'm actually quite proud that one of the things that I was able to get done, even in a time with immigration that has been so divisive, was to create a path to citizenship and to address the longstanding needs of the Minnesota Liberian community with their DED status. That's the kind of thing that we ought to be able to do on a bipartisan basis. And I'm hopeful because, you know, back in 2013, the United States Senate passed immigration reform in a bipartisan way. 68 members, Democrats and Republicans, voted for the kinds of proposals that I've just described. And we can do that again.
You know, we ought to stick with this just a second, Mike. Sure. Yeah, thank you. Because Minnesota right now has the highest number of political refugees per capita in America. The cost can be as high as $80,000. Every local government, if you'd been traveling Minnesota, Senator, would know and would tell you that their budgets are being busted because of some of these costs. They literally can't handle it. So the question becomes, are you going to put Minnesotans first, or are you going to put amnesty and open borders first? I want to know whether you think refugee status should be granted for political persecution or for any reason. I think it should redound or revert back to the original intention of political persecution, and then we have an open door policy. But we can't go around abolishing ICE, getting rid of the Border Patrol, and having open borders, which you've been advocating. America cannot sustain that. And I would add one more thing about compromise. I voted for two Good Lot 1, Good Lot 2 bills in the House of Representatives that would have had a fix for dreamers, including a path to citizenship, would have fixed the Flores consent decree on the border for holding people for 20 days. And yet Nancy Pelosi said no go. Why? Because we wanted $5 billion for a wall. I'm for a wall. My opponent's not, but she's for amnesty. That's the difference.
Tina Smith, are you for open borders and amnesty?
Once again, my opponent is entitled to his opinions, but not to his own facts. I have never said that I was for open borders. That is ridiculous. This hateful language that is designed to drive us apart rather than bringing us together is exactly what we do not need in this country in this moment. And to suggest that immigrants in Minnesota or around this country are a burden to be borne rather than contributors, taxpayers, entrepreneurs is all wrong for Minnesota.
All right.
Would you support the law as it's written for political persecution? I do. Do you?
Okay. Do you want to answer that, Senator?
I believe that our tradition of allowing refugees and asylum seekers to come to this country to build a better life is what we should be doing. And I believe that there are people who are coming to this country who are escaping extreme violence and persecution, and we should not close our doors to those individuals.
Let me just change the subject because we're running a little short on time. I had a question from a listener. How do you think early voting will go? Are you worried about election procedures? Are they fair and secure? Will the results be something you can count on? And I guess the larger context is, will you agree to a peaceful transfer of power? Senator Smith, start with you.
Well, can you imagine that here we are in 2020 and that you have to ask Mike the question of whether we would agree to a peaceful transfer of power? A peaceful transfer of power is the bedrock of our democracy. It has been a consistent element of every election that we have had since George Washington handed the keys over to John Adams. So, of course, I support that peaceful transfer of power. And it is shocking that the President of the United States has been unable to say those simple words. I want Minnesotans to know that we have one of the best election systems anywhere in Minnesota. I'm so proud of what we do. We have one of the highest voter turnouts of any place in the country. And Minnesotans can know that our elections are safe and secure, and you can vote early in person, you can vote early by mail, or you can vote on election day if you choose to do that. And I urge you to do that.
Jason Lewis, any problem with the voting system? Are you confident it will be a fair election?
Well, I am willing to accept the results of the election, of course, and will be happy to be sworn in early next year. That will be a peaceful transition, I guarantee you. The bottom line is it was Hillary Clinton who said, whatever you do, Mr. Biden, don't concede. Imagine somebody saying that. It was Tina Smith and Joe Biden running around the country saying, oh, if the election goes the wrong way, there will be more violence. These are not delegates to the Republican National Convention in the streets rioting and not being prosecuted by local Democrat officials. They are hardcore Democratic socialist leftists. That threatens the peaceful transition of power. When you've got a coup being enacted by the DOJ, which now the Director of National Intelligence said the Hillary Clinton campaign got a source from a Russian disinformation specialist to get a false affidavit to go to a secret court and spy on their opponent. That is not abiding by the peaceful transition of power, which, by the way, is why against most Republicans, I voted against FISA reauthorization.
Okay. You know what? We're just about out of time. So I promised you I'd give you each a minute at the end. Jason Lewis, you got a minute to make your final pitch.
I really do think so much of this is about the will of the people. When you've got a party that, as I mentioned a moment ago, apparently didn't abide by the peaceful transition of power in 2016 and was spying on their opponents, and more of that evidence comes out and out every single day. FBI agents saying, I wanted out of this thing to buy liability insurance because I knew the IG was going to find some really bad stuff here. That's not abiding by the peaceful transition of power. But then again, neither is ending the filibuster to pack the court or granting statehood so you can stay in power forever. You don't like the election. You threaten to ban the Electoral College. You got a group of people, and now, quite frankly, the mobs in the street who are leftists are saying, we're going to do and say anything for power. And those are just the sort of people that shouldn't have it. My opponent is not backing law enforcement. My opponent is not coming down hard on Antifa. And I'd like to hear her say Antifa is not an idea. It's an organization. And we've got to get back to law and order, restoring public order, ending the perpetual lockdowns, and putting Minnesota first in energy, logging, and mining.
All right. Tina Smith, 1 minute to make your final argument.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. I think that you have heard real differences between me and my opponent today. I'm a doer, not a talker. And I think that compromise is a virtue, not a vice, which is why I've been able to get so much done for you in Washington. I think we should protect Medicare, not undo it. And I think that we should improve the Affordable Care Act, not repeal it and throw millions of Americans off of their health care in the middle of a pandemic. So this is what's at stake in this election. Are we going to come together and build forward, or are we going to follow this path of division and fear and chaos that Donald Trump and my opponent have laid out today? So almost 3 years ago, I became your senator. And 2 years ago, you sent me back to Washington. And I go to Washington every day to fight for you, for your health care, your retirement, your family's opportunity. And I think we need leaders in this moment who are going to do the work and get it done. And I ask for your support to continue that together.
DFL Senator Tina Smith, Republican Congressman Jason Lewis, thanks so much. That's our Friday program. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Mike Mulcahy.
Who will control Congress?